Hi, this is my homemade table saw version 2. It's based on the design of my previous homemade table saw, but with various design changes to make it much easier to build. Unlike my previous saw, this one doesn't tilt, the blade only goes up and down, but that's what makes it much easier to build. I built mine with a Makita handheld circular saw, but realistically, most circular saws from places like the Home Depot can be used. Here's two other cheap handheld circular saws, and to make them fit, you have to print out the template for the part that mounts right here. And this one here is a little bit smaller right here, although it's square. So you have to make that cut a little bit more squarish to fit this one. The skill saw here is slightly more challenging because it's a bit wider, so you have to widen this cutout. And it also has this depth scale here, which gets in the way of this piece of plywood that has to go here. So if you use that one, I'd recommend you just cut this part off with a hacksaw. On my previous homemade table saw, I added a throat insert, and the reason I needed that is when tilting the saw, the blade actually moves to the side quite a bit because the saw doesn't use any trunnions. But I found the insert came out a few times, so I actually had to add some screws to hold it down, and the whole thing just became too much of a pain in the butt. On my new design, I just eliminated the tilt mechanism, and that makes the raising mechanism a lot simpler, and I don't need as robust a top because I have more room to reinforce on the bottom, and I don't need an insert because the blade never moves side to side. It is possible that this area around the blade gets chewed up over time, but if that happens, I can always rotate a narrow channel and just put a very narrow insert here. Now, because this one doesn't have an insert, blade changes have to be done from below or by flipping over the top. Even though I used only basic tools in building this saw, it's not a project for those that aren't mechanically inclined. If you're intimidated by building this saw, I'd recommend you just take a circular saw and bolt it to the bottom of a sheet of plywood, like I did in my improvised table saw video. I find this saw is fine for working to about 1/4 millimeter or 64ths of an inch, but not beyond that because the arbor flange is just too small and it's not permanently attached to the arbor. Compared to the arbor on my old Beaver table saw, you can see it's much bigger and it's permanently bonded, and you need that kind of stability if you want to work to 5 thou or 1/10 of a millimeter for precision joinery. I built this saw using just some particle board countertop material that's only this thick. And the nice thing about that is it already has a really hard coating on it. But as I was building it, I realized an old desk would also be a really great material to use. So I made provisions in the plans for how to change it for tops that are much thicker than what I used. How good a saw like this cuts very much depends on how good your blade is, how good your saw is, and how precisely it's built. I have a very detailed set of plans available for this saw on my website, but because the whole idea of this saw is that it's a very inexpensive saw, I priced it very low, so in fact the plans cost about as much as I paid for this cheap saw blade.